we will be discussing the pre-World War I Alliance System. Now, this system, in that it existed in Europe prior to the First World War, is effectively the main reason why World War I was able to break out and why it was able to spread over the entire European continent in the way it did. And if you're looking to understand how World War I broke out, this is the most important thing to come to grips with. But first, some background. So, it does trace its roots all the way back to Napoleon, or rather, the aftermath of Napoleon's conquests. As following Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna, a meeting between all the major European powers that had fought the French, was called, where they basically set up the new European order and effectively attempted to reverse things to how they were before the French Revolution. But Napoleon had already gone about spreading ideas of nationalism and militarism and ideas of people like Germans or Italians needing to belong to one unified state. And this came as a threat to the whole thing that the Congress of Vienna was attempting to uphold, that being the so-called balance of power in Europe. So you'd have power in the west, you have France, you'd have Russia to the east, it's the Ottomans and Austria to the south, of Britain controlling the seas. It's that balance of power that would largely serve to keep the European powers in check. And whilst it would continue to develop over time, such as in the 1860s with the unification of Italy and the beginning of the decline of the Austrian Empire, what would really end up throwing it off was German unification, as we can see depicted in a painting here. The proclamation of the German Empire at the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Now, this created a massive, hyper-industrialized, most well-populated, militaristic United States right in the centre of Europe. It completely upended the balance of power that had existed for centuries prior, whilst also, of course, severely weakening the French and the ability of the French to contribute to that balance of power as well. So it really was a truly significant event in the development of European politics during the time. See, this is how the alliance system emerged from German unification. As well, you effectively had the formation of a pro-German power bloc and an anti-German power bloc. So, obviously, Germans wanted allies, so they turned to first to the Austro-Hungarians, even in spite of the fact that they had actually just fought a war against the Austro-Hungarians only a decade prior. They were able to secure an alliance with them, and they also attempted to secure one with Russia, only for that alliance, the League of the Three Emperors, to break apart pretty quickly. So they then turned it into the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Although Italy wouldn't end up honouring that alliance in World War I, as it was in a defensive alliance, and Italy deemed World War I to be an offensive war, and then they joined the Allies. Anyway, but then we also have this anti-German power bloc that forms. So it's France, and France, they've just been beaten by Germany. They want Germany. They want to be able to effectively secure their security against Germany in the event of another war. And they seek to do this by effectively surrounding Germany. And, well, they are able to form an alliance with Russia in 1890, it's a Franco-Russian alliance, and so that does surround the Central Powers, but they're still overall weaker than Germany, especially Russia, considering how unindustrialized they are. And in fact, this is, of course, exemplified after the Russo-Japanese War, which saw Russia get thoroughly beaten by the Japanese Empire. and as a result, France was also wanting to see if they could gain even more allies. In particular, Britain. As well, Britain, they were still the dominant world power during this time. After all, was the Victorian era, and well, it's called the Victorian era because of Queen Victoria, because Britain was the dominant world power. In fact, this time is called the Pax Britannica, or the British Peace, as they were the dominant world power that effectively ensured that, well, no major power would reasonably consider embarking on such a great European conquest, as that would mean cutting off trade with the Brits, and as a result, effectively cutting off trade with a large part of the world. So Britain was extremely powerful during this time, and there were some overtures from both sides to get them on their side, but the French sort of really invested their time into allying with Britain, eventually forming the Entente Cordiale in 1902. And here's where you really begin to see the formation of this imperial rivalry between Britain and Germany. And this idea of this imperial rivalry, where different powers are competing for territory and influence, this is also another major factor in the alliance system, as it effectively pits these powers against each other. And you particularly see this, mostly between Britain and Germany, as they compete, both for colonies abroad, and Germany, and in particular their Kaiser Wilhelm II, was particularly annoyed by how few colonies they had compared to other, what they deemed to be lesser European powers. So they were wanting to expand their colonies and gain more influence, as well as also getting a better border against Russia, a shorter border, by establishing a number of puppet states. That was sort of their plan, and that's what they did in World War One. But also, this direct rivalry with the British, and you especially see Wilhelm II personally had a lot of animosity for the British, and so this leads into the Anglo-German naval arms race and the Agadir crisis. Agadir being this part of Morocco down here, where Germany attempted to effectively challenge Britain and France, and they didn't necessarily succeed, but it still served to heighten tensions in Europe. So, in short, what you have is two power blocks, so the Central Powers and the Entente, and in the words of the historian A.G.P. Taylor, the European powers had created a doomsday machine where mobilization meant war. And you see, the whole trouble with the alliance system is how interconnected it is. It allows for what I like to call regional spillover. This is a cartoon from 1914, and it actually depicts this rather well. So World War One, it begins out as this regional conflict between Serbia and Austria. So Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets shot, and a month after that, the Austrians declare war on Serbia. But Serbia is supported by Russia, since Russia was also supporting Pan-Slavic nationalism down there, which further heightened that imperial rivalry and pre-war tension. But since Russia was supporting Serbia and Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia therefore declared war on the Austro-Hungarians. And then, since the Austro-Hungarians were allied with the Germans therefore declared war on the Russians. And since the Russians were allied with the French, it meant that the French then declared war on the Germans. And since the main German plan, the Schlieffen Plan, and called for marching through Belgium to get into France, and Belgium was guaranteed by the British, that called in the British. And so you really see this sort of spillover, this chain reaction, where when a regional conflict begins, and this effectively results in beginning to knock down dominoes, which eventually cascade into this wider European cataclysm. When one little conflict, as long as it's between two powers in some way, can then spread right throughout the alliance system and consume the entire continent in war. And this is, in effect, what the alliance system was and the effect that it had in World War One. As if it didn't exist, then yes, perhaps the Austro-Hungarian and Serbian conflict could have actually remained a regional affair. But that alliance system allows for this spillover, this chain reaction that eventually made World War One inevitable. So, thank you very much for watching. If you have any further questions whatsoever, please leave them in the comments down below, and I will try to answer as many of them as I can. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.